Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. Now, actually have a couple of episodes of Strange Playgrounds to produce and release here, one of which involves a fairly lengthy discussion on the mythology and background of the Dark Souls and Bloodborne games with Monsieur Andy Millman, whose channels you can find links to below. But that one's going to take a little bit of time because it requires other things. It requires footage, it requires a little bit of editing, and so on and so forth. This episode, I really want to talk about something that's going on that was recently released on Netflix, actually, which is the series The Haunting of Hill House. Now, as those of you who enjoy this kind of fiction will know, there have been multiple adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House, or The Haunting as it is sometimes known, some of which are massively successful, some of which are entirely execrable. As a result of which, I was all ready to hate this series out of the gate, all ready to hate it. The original 1963 film, which is simply known as The Haunting, is one of my favourite horror films in existence. It's absolutely beautiful. It's elegant, it's subtle, it's ambiguous. It treats its audience with unfathomable respect. One of the wonderful things about the original film, it's a kind of text for haunted house horror, in the sense that it gives you everything you would expect from haunted house horror, but then inverts it. It is extremely ambiguous as to what is happening. You hardly see anything in the entire film. There is only one tiny, very, very subtle effect, which in and of itself may not actually be real. Part of the fun of the original Haunting is that all of the characters involved have psychological issues. One in particular, which the film is largely, it seems to be shot from the perspective of, which is Nell. She has some incredible psychological problems, which Hill House, it's hard to say whether it exacerbates or whether it acts as a kind of big psychic amplifier for, or whether there is actually some kind of malign intelligence at work, whether there actually is a haunting, whether there actually is a ghost or a spectre or a series of ghosts involved. It's very difficult to tell. And the film is wonderfully clever in that it never comes down one way or the other. It never comes down one way or the other. All you really know about Hill House in the original film is that it is a place where tragedy occurs. It seems to be a place that's almost accursed. It has incredible bad juju surrounding it, which is really cool. The only effect in the original film, there is this bizarre effect where it looks as though a door is very slightly breathing, where it's sort of pulsing in and out, and that's it. That's it. And that may not be real. Everything else is implication. Everything else are these wonderful set pieces where you hear noises and the characters describe experiencing things like cold spots and senses of dread and foreboding, but you, as the viewer, see nothing. It does that very clever thing that I absolutely adore in horror films, where it drops you in as a kind of almost documentary observer. You are watching these people slowly go mad inside this house, and that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I adore the original film. It's so clever. It's how you do a haunted house film insofar as I'm concerned. I mean, there are lots of different ways and lots of different interpretations of that very, very particular subgenre. I mean, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have things like Poltergeist, which is this special effects extravaganza where there most definitely is not only a ghost, there are lots of ghosts, and there are monsters, and there are malign entities, and it's all very sort of Ghost Train ride and Steven Spielberg, and that's wonderful too. I really like Poltergeist for that reason. It's much more sort of a popcorn film, which is great. But for my money, if you want to see an text, there are a couple actually. There are texts for haunted house films. There's the original 1963 Haunting. There's The Innocents, which is an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and the Innocents does exactly what what The Haunting does, whereby it gives you what appears to be a very classical haunted house story, but is actually much more of a psychological story in the end. It's actually about the main character who is, as it turns out, a very twisted, sick woman. That's ultimately what it comes out being. It's a beautiful story, really dark, very nihilistic, very misanthropic actually. Well worth going and reading the original book as well, by the way. And the others are things like Poltergeist, where it goes to the opposite end of the spectrum, where there is definitely a ghost. It is big, it is bravura, and there are effects-driven ghost train ride moments. There's Poltergeist. There's the original Amityville Horror from the 1970s. Now, that's an interesting one because that is actually based on real events, as it were. That doesn't mean that the film is a documentary. Obviously, the film is a drama, but it's very good. It's very well done. It actually provides a very subtle and interesting take on the haunted house story. The actual events that transpired, it's a con. It's a big ass con. If you go and do the research into George Lutz, he was the sort of father of the family that the events actually purportedly happened to. It's a big old con. He basically bought that house knowing that he could make a buck off of it, and with stories of a haunting, and that's basically it. It is an absolute con. But the original film, the 1979 film, is really good. It's well worth checking out. It's sort of somewhere in between the Haunting and Poltergeist, in the sense that you have the psychological element with this family slowly going mad in this apparently haunted house, but you also have actual supernatural things happening. And it's kind of good. It's got a real, like a lot of films from the 1970s, it's got this real atmosphere to it, this sort of dreamy, soft focus, almost nightmarish quality. Those are all wonderful, wonderful, wonderful haunted house films. The problem I tend to have with haunted house films is that, like possession films, there is this tendency for them to be very formulaic. There is this tendency for them to follow very particular patterns, and that makes them dull. It makes them powerfully dull. There is also a tendency for them to be very simplistic. It's one of the reasons why I hate The Conjuring. The Conjuring is one of those weird things where people went mad over it. People went absolutely insane. People who like horror went insane over The Conjuring. And I went to see it, and I just didn't like it. I thought that it was boring. I thought it was cliche. I thought everything in it had been done before a million times better. I found it manipulative in the crassest way. The metaphysical simplicity of it bothered me enormously. Another thing that bothers me enormously about it is the same thing that bothers me about George Lutz, and that is the Warrens are involved. For those of you who don't know, the Warrens are they're this pair of Christian fundamentalist supernatural investigators and exorcists from the US, and they're real people, and they are basically vultures. They are so blatantly con artists. What they do is they circle around looking for situations where you have vulnerable families, where you have people who have psychological problems, or who will get in on the deal, and they swoop down and they exacerbate the problem, then they write books about it. That's their entire deal. They are conscious, absolute fucking frauds, and I really hate them. I absolutely loathe them. And one of the problems I have with The Conjuring, one of the many problems I have with The Conjuring, is it lionizes them. It actually lionizes them, which fucks me off to the nth degree, I've got to say. These people are conscious con artists, and it really bothers me. But it's the Conjuring I really don't get. It's just something I don't get. I don't find it frightening. I don't find it atmospheric. I find if you fed into a computer all of the haunted house and possession films from the last couple of decades, The Conjuring is what you'd get. It's not particularly badly made by any degree. It's a fairly well-made film. It's just dull. It's just boring. It's the same problem I have with remakes of the Amityville Horror, for example, which is absolutely atrocious. Talking about remakes, in 1999 there was an effort to remake The Haunting, and It's everything that's wrong with Hollywood remakes. It is everything that's wrong. It's decided by committee and edited by boardroom, you know. It's by test audience. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. It does away with every aspect that made the original noteworthy. It's this CG laden, special effects driven populist piece of shit. Essentially, it's awful. It's absolutely awful. What bothers me about it so profoundly is that, like a lot of remakes, it powerfully misunderstands what makes the original so good. It just powerfully misunderstands it. And that's really, really frustrating. And it's a bit of a slap in the face, essentially. It's a bit of a slap in the face. All of the ambiguity, all of the subtlety, all of that clever implication and those psychological elements, all gone. All gone. And the people who are in it, I mean, my God, I mean, did they need a buck or something? Were they having tax problems? That's all I can think of, because it's a piece of dreck, is what it is. It's a piece of absolute dreck. Now, as a result of that film, largely, when I saw that Netflix had released a series of The Haunting, I was very dubious. I was very, very dubious indeed. I was all ready to hate it. All ready to hate it. The thing about Netflix series I find is they're either astonishingly good, like Black Mirror, or they are atrocious. And I mean absolutely atrocious, like Scream, like the TV series of Scream that they did. So I came to it a little bit timidly, to say the least. And you know what? It won me over almost immediately. From almost the first scene. The reason it won me over is because it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. This is a hard sell for me. I am saturated with haunted house stories. I've seen so many. I've read so many. There's only so much you can do with the format before it becomes cliche. Before you have to do something very, very different with it. And also, to my mind, a lot of the very best ones are so good it's very difficult to overcome them. Things like the original Haunting, like The Shining. The Shining is another really good example. Actually, The Shining is a wonderful, wonderful example of how you intermingle these concepts together. So in The Shining, you have, and I mean Stanley Kubrick's Shining, not the awful one that Stephen King directed. Stanley Kubrick's Shining, which is a million miles away from the original book, and is actually, for my money, better than the original book, but that's just me. It intermingles the psychological aspect with the supernatural aspect, and the supernatural elements are subtle, they're slowly building, beautifully done, whereas the psychological aspects are tense and pulsating and waiting to explode from the very beginning. And I love that. I love that. I think it's a wonderful horror film. And again, one of the texts of haunted house fiction. But this series had a really hard sell for me. It had a really hard time to get me intrigued, and it did almost immediately. For one thing, as I said, it's beautiful. It's so well shot. It's so elegantly crafted. There are certain shots and sequences that are comprised like paintings, and I love that. I love that in horror in particular, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to make horror films beautiful, and to make them beautiful and also still terrifying and tense and dreadful, dread-inspiring. It's a very hard thing to do. This series is gorgeous. It shoots not only its characters but its settings with this languorous, loving quality. It loves its characters and it loves its settings. What's really cool about it, you have this wonderful contrast between Hill House. And Hill House is as gothic as it ever was. It's gorgeous. It's this big, rotting manor with wings and spires and staircases. It's absolutely beautiful. It's straight out of Poe, you know? It's straight out of Poe, Hill House. It could be the House of Usher, you know, it's got that quality about it. There's another very good example of a purportedly haunted house piece of fiction that isn't. You know, it's very clever. But you've got that contrasted with very urban and very postmodern settings, and that is counterpoint. That works thematically as well, because Hill House is very much the past. Hill House is very much a kind of crystallized past, whereas the urban settings are set in the present. It's very clever, and the series has this wonderful method of storytelling where it switches back and so you have this kind of interplay between multiple story arcs with multiple characters that are switching from one time to another. You know, there are situations where they're children, there are situations where they're older, where they're adults, and it's filling in the gaps. It's trying to show you what happened to bring them to the status that they occupy as adults, which is not enviable for the most part. One of the things the series does, which I thought was very clever, was that it takes characters and names from the original film or from the original story, and it sort of changes them into something else. It makes them into something a bit more coherent. Most of the characters become parts of the Crane family, who as adults are all estranged because of their experiences at Hill House. All broken people, all with their own psychological issues, all in denial of what originally happened for the most part in their own way. Some of them are drug addicts, some of them are sex addicts, some of them they're in absolute denial. They become basically unfeeling and stony. It's really quite wonderful. And one of the things that works so well, the characters are all engaging and interesting and complex. And then you have the setting, the situation. Then you have Hill House and its supernatural elements. And this is, I mean, one of the things the series does do, this is a spoiler, by the way, it is definitely supernatural. What's happening in Hill House? There is a supernatural element. There are definitely ghosts. There are definitely, and in fact, it's more than that. There is something almost science fiction about Hill House, which I won't spoil here, but it's well worth having a look at, well worth delving into, and very, very fascinating by the end. But it's what the series focuses on more than anything are these characters. It's their psychological issues, it's their relationships with one another, it's how the house affects them. And it's wonderful. It's really, really clever. So yeah, it's powerfully clever. And what's so cool about it is that the characters are beautifully written and complex, even from when they're children to when they're adults, and the dynamic between them is wonderful. The whole thing is very heightened. It's not really real. It's all of the characters are very, very heightened and sort of archetypes that work very, very well within the format of this kind of fiction, but they are elaborated. They become very, very complex as the show progresses, and you become very attached to them. As awful as they can be, as hateful as they can be, you really understand that they are damaged. They're damaged people, largely because of this house, largely because of their experiences at Hill House, but you get the impression that they would be damaged anyway. All Hill House does, it seems, is exacerbates the problems that are already there. It is, as I said before, what I love about it, it's like a big psychic amplifier. It's as though somehow in its construction or because of some quirk of where it is, it's become a kind of strange engine for psychic energy, for negative psychic energy, and it's absolutely beautiful. That's what it preys on. It's a kind of big sentient monster. The house itself has become sentient, largely because of the tragedies that have occurred there. It's like it's absorbed the ethos of tragedy and become the spawn of it. I mean, that's not uncommon in haunted house fiction. You often have this notion that somehow events within a house or within a setting absorb into it and cause it to become sentient, or cause it to become an amplifier for particular kinds of situations, emotions, or energies. And that's what you've got here in Hill House. It's not a new thing at all. The Overlook Hotel in The Shining is exactly the same. but it's a very cleverly done. It's very beautifully done here, and as I said, the shots. My God, the shots. Some of the set pieces in this series are gorgeous. There are more very overt pieces as well, where you actually do see like CG ghosts and whatnot, but that actually works somehow. They somehow managed to make that work. And usually, I will say this out of the gate, usually CG in horror films is shite. It just doesn't work. It works in situations like fantasy, like in The Lord of the Rings or whatnot, or in Harry Potter, where you're operating on a heightened level of reality anyway. But it's unusual for it to be to work in a horror film, certainly in a ghost story, which tends to require some degree of verisimilitude, some sort of psychological realism to make it work. Very rarely works, but they're so beautifully designed, shot, and framed in this that it doesn't matter. And the way, again, getting into spoilers here, but the way the story links the ghosts to the living, the past to the present, and introduces that as a mechanic, as a storytelling mechanic. I mean, I kind of got it. I kind of got what it was doing at a particular point. I remember thinking to myself, is this going to do what I think it's going to do? Is it? I won't say too much, but it's playing with time, with notions of time, and breaking apart the notion of time being linear. It's very clever, and it's something that haunted house fiction does a lot. If you look at the ending of The Shining, for example, that does it. This is doing something very similar to that, and I really, really like the way it does it. It's very clever. It's very, very, very clever. My particular favourite ghost is the very tall man with the cane. The way he is framed and the set pieces in which he occurs are absolutely terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. He is brilliant and beautiful, and I love him. Absolutely love him. Hill House, it's a bit like Silent Hill. I don't know what it is about that particular word and this subject. The term hill the suffix hill seems to be part of it all, doesn't it, for some reason? But it's like it shows those within it parts of themselves. It shows them who they are and things that they want and things that they dread and things that they desire, and then it twists it. It uses it as a way in to subvert them. It drives them mad, and it feeds on their anxieties and their sublimated neuroses, and it makes them part of itself. It sort of like feeds on the energy of when they die almost, and makes them part of itself. So the house is just rancid with ghosts. It's just rank with them. They're like cockroaches. They are everywhere, and they become, in their turn, facilitators of its appetite. It's very clever. It's very cool. I love how monolithic Hill House is. It's got such presence in this series, such incredible presence, and it's hard to do. As I said, it's hard to make that concept legitimate now, because it's been done so much and so many times, and badly for the most part. Very, very, very poorly. Very often, when you get haunted house style fiction, it is just a derivative, in the same way that when you get possession films, they're just derivatives of The Exorcist. Most haunted house films are just derivatives of the likes of the original Haunting, like derivatives of The Shining, of Poltergeist, or of whatever. And they're just not interesting. They tread very familiar territory, and this treads very familiar territory too. There's very little here that's new. That's what's so interesting about it. Very little that's new, but it does it beautifully. It does it so well, you don't care. You really love these characters, and it's so beautifully rendered that you just cannot take your eyes from it. It's so well put together. The sound design, the lighting, the effects, the way the characters are shot and framed, it's just beautiful. Whoever did the camera work on this, I just hats off, because it's brilliant. There are some panning shots in this where the camera is following characters through very elaborate sets, and it's seamless. It is absolutely stunning. I just, on a technical level, this is a triumph. It's an absolute triumph. Then you've got the writing, which is wonderful. Then you've got the just the mood of the whole piece, the ethos, which is sublime. You've got the characters, which are distinct and likable. Even at their worst, they're likable. It's brilliant. It's quite brilliant. And I've got to say, the conclusion was totally unexpected in terms of the emotions that it arouses. I was in bits in the last episode, in absolute bits. I couldn't stop crying after the first episode, after the last episode, because it's gorgeous. It inverts everything, all of the nihilism, the dirt, the dreariness, the sheer malevolence of this whole story. It completely inverts and turns it into a story that has a strange hopefulness to it. And it's gorgeous. It's so clever. It's so clever. But it doesn't do it in a mawkish way. It doesn't do it in this overly sentimentalized way. It's still dark. It's still a story about despair, but it's about overcoming despair. And it is about like love. It is. I mean, I tend to hate this. I hate it when love saves the day, but it kind of does here, and it does it in a very beautiful way. It is redemptive. It's properly redemptive, and I thought that was gorgeous. I thought it was beautiful. It's I can't, it's rare these days that I will find a piece of horror that does this to me, that actually affects me so profoundly, and this one did. This one really did it for me, ladies and gents. I've got to say, go and watch it. It is a sublime bit of work. It really is. It is absolutely sublime. It's not over long, it doesn't overstay its welcome, which a lot of TV series do. It has a very definite story to tell, and it does it with economy, it does it with grace. Yeah, this is TV at its best, quite frankly. This is how it should be, where it's challenging, it's interesting, it's beautiful, where it's invigorating and it's inspired, and it makes you feel things. That's what I really ache for from all media. As I've said before, I ache to feel stuff with media. There's so much media that's total fucking dross, that is only designed to placate you, it's only designed to comfort you. And what I ache for is the stuff that doesn't. The stuff that triggers you. That's what media's for. It's designed to arouse these associations. It's designed to make you confront things. That's what it's for. And, this does broach on those subjects, those very subjects. It really does. And I think that may be why why I enjoyed it so much, because it's got such catharsis. It's got such catharsis. It's stunningly beautiful. And I cannot recommend it enough. I really can't. It deserves to be watched. It deserves to do well. Especially when it's sat there amongst such dross, such bad work. It is a jewel. It's an absolute jewel. I loved it. I loved it. And I really, really cannot emphasize how good it is. If you enjoy this kind of fiction, if it's your bag, if you enjoy the original Haunting, if you like The Shining, if you like haunted house fiction, this is going to do it for you. This is absolutely going to do it for you. The only other thing I'd say is Hill House is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I want to live there. Ghosts and all, psychic amplification and all, I want to live there. It's one of those things where I couldn't help but wonder what it would bring out in me. Like Silent Hill. What would your Silent Hill be? Because Silent Hill is different for everyone who goes there. The town reforms itself and becomes like a reflection of their inner psyches, of their neuroses. The same is true of Hill House. It reflects back at you what you bring to it. So what would it show you? What do you think it would dredge up from your subconscious? I'd be fascinated to see what demons it would fling in your face, in my own face. I'd love to know. What sickness have I so sublimated that I'm so afraid to face? What is it? Well, that's it. That's it for me. That's what I would like to know. And it's fascinating to me. That whole concept is fascinating. I'd love to do, actually. I'd love to write. I might do it. I'd love to write either a short story series or like a series of short films or a TV series, which is about something like Hill House, but about different characters who come to it and experience different things, and it shows them different stories. It shows them different parts of themselves. That'd be a great base for like an anthology, actually, or a collection. It's a very solid concept. And I've just got a thing about places that are not and it's not necessarily sentient, although it kind of is, but that are alive, that have this saturation of state, this almost elemental force. I've got something about that. I loved it in The Shining. I loved it in the original Haunting. I love it in Stephen Volk's Ghost Watch. I love it in this. I love it in this. I think it's a wonderful concept. I adore it, and I will go back to that again and again and again and again. Feed me that always and forever. It's like dessert for me. It's like a big rich old horror chocolate fondant, and I'll just devour it forever and ever. So yes, when we come back, I will probably have the Bloodborne and Dark Souls episode edited together. So look forward to that, ladies and gents. Until then, bye bye.